We are in the midst of a series based on the book by Richard Rohr called The Naked Now. The Naked Now by Richard Rohr. He is a Franciscan and he runs a contemplative center and really invites us into a deep look at the practice and what we're doing in our lives, how we're activating our spirituality, and really in line with the Fillmores and in line with Unity's traditional beginnings. He presents these tools as tools that really can reach anyone where they are. Tools that go beyond religion, but into the deep practice, into what the birthing of the movement of Christianity really was intended for. And as we're, is relevant to us in our conversation, what the birthing of New Thought and Unity practice was relevant for. And knowing that these practices and this spiritual understanding and reading and everything that we do is not to create more division, not to create more camps to stand in and go, this is it, this is my way, it's the right way, but to really open our heart into spiritual experience. So today we're discussing something pretty fun. Are you ready? We're talking about judgment today. Judgment, judgment, judgment. So I'm not going to ask for hands because I don't want to cultivate lying here. But is anyone? No, don't do it. If there's anyone who says they don't judge, they don't judge. I just don't judge people. I don't judge. I applied my spiritual practice and I'm done with that. I have doubts about that. I have doubts about that. I have some ideas around judgment, and they might not be so traditional, but we're going to talk about some of those, and we're going to talk about Richard Rohr, and we're going to talk about Charles Fillmore today, and we're going to talk about you, and we're going to talk about me when it comes to judgments. So I invite you to just take a deep breath with me, because the core of today is radical self-inventory and radical self-compassion and acceptance. That is the framework from which we have that conversation. So if you're not willing to step into that framework, I would hit the bye-bye button right now. Because the idea of judgment and discussing judgments is not here to judge you. It is not here to judge any of us. It is not here to limit us. It is here to emancipate us. In Unity, we have a concept of what we call the Christ. That's not exactly Jesus, but it is Jesus as well. But it's this idea of the Christ, which is the awakened one, the anointed one, the idea of humanity in expression, the idea of us as humans and spiritual beings in our divine blueprint, at our height of what we were intended to be and what we are. So we have a concept of the Holy Trinity, which is from traditional Christianity. And the Holy Trinity in tradition is Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And in Unity, we teach that Father is mind or God mind, and you could call it whatever you want. It doesn't need any names. It doesn't care. You're not going to disappoint it. There's nothing you can do to change it. It is. And then there is Father, Son, the Son, and in Unity, it's mind idea, the idea of you, the idea of Jesus, the idea of me, mind idea. And that idea is also the Son. So Father, Son. And that is obviously not a gender specific idea. It is the idea in the birth of the mind, the great all of its creation, of its expressiveness. And then you've got the Holy Spirit, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, mind, idea, expression. That is the activity of it. It's the breath of life. It is the movement, the motion, that creative principle of life. And so you've got mind, idea, expression. And then we go to that idea and we go to Jesus, who is an example of that, an example of the highest expression. And we know that his last name wasn't Christ, that actually was his spiritual identity. And that is the anointed one. That's the awakened one. That is our higher self. When our higher self is in tune with the full being, when it is in charge of this beingness, that's the Christ. And so we have a term that you might hear in traditional Unity of beholding the Christ. I behold the Christ in you. This is the same as in yoga. when you say namaste. The light in me greets the light in you. It is the acknowledgement that at your core, you are born blessed. At your core, you are divinity and expression. At your core, you are the breath of God, awakened, ignited, alive. That's what it is. It is knowing that the light in me, that highest self in me, beholds and greets the highest self in you. So it's a coming together from third eye seeing, as Richard Rohr would call it, third eye seeing. It is to behold, even in the dictionary definition of behold, it's to see a person or a thing, especially as especially remarkable or impressive. It's to see beyond the limitations and beyond the human conditions to the impressive nature of beings here in expression. And so this exploration of beholding the light within each other, within all beings, really can be an adventure of the mind, no? Richard Rohr received a letter and he shared a quote from the letter in one of our chapters. And it said this in the letter. The person said, how are we supposed to see one another as Christs? There is so much contrary evidence. How are we supposed to see each other as Christ? There is so much contrary evidence. Do we just pretend? I love that person and I love the authenticity of that question. Do we just pretend? Like there's no confusion going on the mind. The person's seeing what they're seeing. They're like, this is what I see. I'm just having a little trouble with this. Like, are you saying we should just like make it up? Are you saying we should just pretend and just act like we see this and that's not what we're seeing? Like that is absolutely not what I'm seeing when you fill in the blank. When I interact with you, when I get on social media, when I look at the news, when I hang out with whoever it is, family, whatever it is, when I go to work, whatever it is. Do we just pretend? It's a good question. Can you entertain the thought that a spiritual practice, and with a spiritual practice, the answer to this can be simple? The answer to this can be simple. Do I just pretend? There is a realm where you move beyond pretending and you move into knowing and affirming. So in Unity, we have a history of physical healing, spiritual healing. And you do that not looking at something and just pretending and going, oh, I see an injury. Oh, I see an illness. Oh, I see this. I see that. I see a condition, whether it's physical, whether it's prosperity or whatever. I see it and I'm just now going to pretend that it's not there. No, that's called a spiritual bypass. But what we do is we recognize that we have a separate sense of self. We do recognize that we have a mind that thinks. We do recognize that we're human. We do recognize that we have an ego. We do recognize that we live in a physical body and we feel physical limits. But then we also recognize that there is one power and one presence, that we are part of that power and one presence, an expression of it, that we are made from it, and that we have co-creative faculties, and that we actually have the power to step into a truth principle and stand in it from such a grounded space that we see through the illusion of separation, through the illusion of illness, through the illusion of poverty, through the illusion of lack, through the illusion of discord, through the illusion that is addressed in this question about having to pretend, through the illusion of the missing Christ. And we see right to the truth. And from this practice, we enter into another realm of experience. Because from this practice, it is truth. It's not pretending, it's affirming, and it's co-creating, and it's holding the high watch for each other when we are low. And it's a pretty deep practice, even though it sounds simple. But a couple of words from Richard Rohr help me to make it very clear what our invitation is. And he says this, he says, I've said it before and I'll say it again. He says, transformed people transform people. I think that's my favorite quote from his book. Transformed people transform people. Because when I heard it, I heard something else in my own mind. I heard a second part to that sentence. I heard hurt people hurt people. Hurt people hurt people. And that opens my heart. That opens my heart to recognize that when I am not able to see others as their awakened self or their true nature, and when my eyes are fixated on the contrary evidence, my spiritual practice reminds me that it makes sense. It makes sense. Hurt people hurt people. So it makes sense that people come from interesting places when people have interesting experiences. And it makes it a lot easier to step back into the practice and to behold the wholeness in others. We live in a world where the masks don't come off. We try to hide behind them, but we're always sifting through layers of what we're trying to cover up, what we can see, what we can't see. And then you've got the lenses, and the lenses don't really come off. You've got the lenses of this is how I perceive this. This is what I already thought before we talked to you. This is what I'm going to say as I make a nutshell judgment and a nutshell comment about everyone or everything or people that I haven't even spoken to. And that's just part of the human condition. That's just part of the human condition. I judge all the time. I judge the person who sent me text because somehow my phone number was leaked somewhere. So the person who's sending me totally inappropriate, weird texts in the middle of the night, you know what I'm talking about? If you don't, I hope that you don't know and keep not knowing. And I judge when it comes up that there's another threat or there are a series of threats moving through our schools, copycat threats moving through our schools about violence and about danger, putting children and parents into a tailspin about whether or not their kids are going to school. I judge when I experience something that feels like disrespect. I judge when it feels like people aren't following the rules. I judge when I see someone not wearing a mask when a local mask mandate is in effect. I judge. I judge when I hear racist language, when I see systems that are outdated, that are not working, when I see actions that don't align with love. I judge when I see environmental craziness still happening in this day and age, and we could do better. I judge. You know, when I got the last text, I even texted back, like in the middle of the night, I texted back, maybe it was in the next morning, but I said, you know, I am a kid and this is something you can go to jail for. And my dad's a detective and he says you're going to jail. You know, I mean, you can't text a kid stuff like that. That's a very bad illegal invitation. Apparently it's okay to do to adults, but I thought, hey, let's give them something back. You want to play? I'll play. I judge. I get involved with my ego in things that happen. Here's what I think. We have all these great spiritual philosophies that say, do not judge. And that's beautiful. That's a goal to attain. But on the path there, in the practice of getting there, it can feel really unrealistic. And when we get too high and mighty thinking that we're doing it and we've got it down, we can sometimes create such an immense blind spot that we don't realize we're in the midst of it. But I don't think that's a problem. I just think it's the human condition. I think the problem isn't so much that we judge, it's that we believe our judgments. The problem is not so much that the mind does what the mind does. It's that we believe it. We invest in it. We act from it. When we believe our judgments, we live in a world of what's wrong rather than what is. And that's just not a friendly world to live in. Charles Fillmore talked about judgment. And he invited us into the idea that judgment is actually a spiritual power. Is actually one of 12 spiritual powers. And not just 12 spiritual powers that we just have to play around with, but 12 divine faculties that each need to be developed in order to demonstrate the Christed consciousness, in order to have an awakening, in order to advance along the spiritual path, in order to experience the fullness of our being. And he called judgment one of those divine faculties. And this is what he said about judgment. He said, by clearing your understanding and acknowledging the one supreme mind in which is all discrimination, you can cultivate the ability of your mind to arrive quickly at right conclusions. Take the stand that it is your inheritance from God to judge wisely and quickly. Do not depart, therefore, by statements of inefficiency and matters of judgment. He also said, when you are in doubt as to the right thing to do in attaining justice in worldly affairs, ask that the eternal spirit of justice shall go forth on your behalf and bring about and restore to you that which is your very own. So he implored us to develop judgment within ourselves, aligned with spiritual practice, and also to call it forth in prayer and in practice. He said, good judgment is developed from principle. In its perfection, it is expressed through our mind, with all its absolute relations uncurtailed. We, man, has the right concept of judgment, and ideally, the judges of our courts have that unbiased and unprejudiced discrimination whichever exists in the absolute. A prejudiced judge is abhorred. A judge who allows himself to be moved by his sympathies is not considered safe. He goes on to say, it is necessary to place judgment in the absolute in order to demonstrate its supreme power. This is accomplished by one's first declaring that one's judgment is spiritual and not material. Spiritual and not material. That its origin is in God. That all its conclusions are based on truth and that they're absolutely free from prejudice, false sympathies, or personal ignorance. Doesn't that sound good? Doesn't that sound like some judgment you want to have? Like, bring it on. Let's get some systems going in our world, in our country, in our community, and in our minds that are free from prejudice, false sympathies, or personal ignorance, that are based on truth, based on principle, based on practice, based on the absolute. He says this gives a working center from which the ego, or I am, begins to set in order its own thought world. The habit of judging others, even in the most significant matters of daily life, must be discontinued. The law of judgment works out in a multitude of directions. So he is inviting us to lift up the human judgment and let that be the one that doesn't get the power, and to step into this spiritual divine faculty. The mind does what the mind does. What is helpful about judgment is that it helps us navigate the world. It helps us understand behavior and understand character. It helps us sometimes not to fall into the same habits. The definition talks about the ability to make considered decisions or come to sensible conclusions. If anyone else out there has a difficult time making judgments, sometimes you recognize, you find yourself in interesting situations when you don't know how to make wise judgments. I have a friend that always nurtures little ones by saying, use your wise judgment. Use your wise judgment. Not don't judge, but use it. You have a power, use it. You have a power, use it. There is a place you can test those judgments. It's right in your heart. It's based on principle and the absolute. So how judging helps us? Well, it helps us. It gives us clarity. It gives us boundaries. It gives us awareness. What's not helpful? Well, it's clear what's not helpful about judgment. Demonizing, otherizing, polarizing, ostracizing, projecting, future pacing, labeling. You could go on and on. But we're here to demonstrate spiritual judgment. In The Naked Now with Richard Rohr, he says this: in all situations, of course, the all-important question is it true? He gives us that tool to use the question, is it true? He goes on to say, not is it from my group? Does it please me? Does it displease me? Does it use my vocabulary and my definitions? That's a good one. Not even is it 100% true. Who cares, the saint would say. Only the ego cares, the Buddhist would say. And the ego is not interested in truth or in God or in control. If it is even 10% true, the saint is grateful and happy for the gift. He goes on to say, St. Thomas Aquinas said in the 13th century, if it is true, then it is from the Holy Spirit. In the 13th century, he says, when Christians demonized Muslims even more than they do today, St. Francis told us friars that if we found a page of the Quran, we should kiss it and place it on the altar. His Christian truth, he said, was not fear-based. He could honor God and holiness anywhere it was found, and not just inside of his own symbol system. That's based on the absolute. That's based on truth, on principle, on practice. Richard Rohr goes on to say, if there is indeed one God of all the earth, then it is this one God who is breaking through in every age and culture. And monotheists should be the first to recognize that truth is one and God is all in all. He says they usually, though, end up fearing and even opposing these ideas, probably because in their own lives, their religion has been tribal more than transformative. Perhaps we want to belong to something exclusive, the equivalent of a religious country club. But by that time, of course, our God has become very small and been whittled down to our size. Hear that with me. Religion has been tribal more than transformative. And our God has become very small and whittled down to our size. As Rumi says, there are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Richard Rohr goes on to say most writers in the early Christian era called this radical perceptual shift away from the judging and separate self contemplation. It's contemplation, it's higher order thinking, it's higher order presencing, it's higher order awareness. He goes on to say, Buddhists call it meditation, sitting, or practicing. the prayer of the heart, ecstasy, living from the divine spark, non-dual knowing, or simply breathing. Those are the other spiritual practices and the foundation of what this is called. In unity, we often call it meditation and mindfulness, awareness. The Christ. Native religions founded in communion with nature itself, the great spirit, the dance, the ritual, he says. But it's here to be found. It's a divine faculty and it's available to each one of us. So we can ask ourselves when we have our judgments, are they useful? Is it based on a sense of separation, a sense of division, a sense of demonizing, a sense of othering? Or is it emerging forth from my divine faculty, my birthright? Is it beholding the Christ? Is it a namaste? You know, there was a podcast a friend was recently listening to and shared with me, and shared that in the podcast, they said that there's been research that's been done, but most people, when looking at the Holocaust and looking at Auschwitz, it's like most people want to think they'd be the one that really does something. They'd be the one that, you know, opens the door, that changes it, that shifts it, that stands up. And he reminded us, he said, don't be misled. Most of you would have been guards in Auschwitz. That's just research on the human condition. So what is it like to apply the spiritual condition? What is it like to become humble and step out of that judgment that always says, I do it better, I know better, you're wrong, you're awful, and creates a different paradigm? When we believe our judgments, we live in a world of what's wrong rather than what is. And that's not a friendly world to live in. But we have judgments about just about everything, don't we? We really do. If you watch your mind, just watch your mind for a little bit. The mind just, that's like what it does. It's just like a little system of judgments. You know, we even have judgments around the word judgment and whether it should be spelled with an E or without an E. The British have a little more tolerance around the E. Well, not here. If you're in the United States, that is. It can be disappointing and frustrating and polarizing to be stuck in our ego judgments, in our human judgments. But life softens when we move from believing our judgments or making them right into observing them, being curious about them, feeling the feelings that come after them. So what if we just let them be and allow ourselves to see that when we let them be, things start making more sense? Like, isn't there a lot right now that just doesn't make sense, that you're like, this does not make sense? It's painful. It's painful. But can we invite ourselves into some spiritual understanding that comes from spiritual judgment, where we can look and know that the light is within everyone? Can we enter into the movement of understanding, like, well, yeah, it makes sense that they would hurt people, they're hurt. It makes sense that they would show up like that. That's the world in which they live. That's the paradigm in which they're immersed. So it makes sense. Like, it's just my ego that makes that wrong on top of going, it is what it is. Like, It makes sense that, to my mind, there's no reason going on there. To my mind, I don't see the reason, the reasoning, because they're in belief. You can't argue with belief. Memo. You can't argue with belief. Doesn't always follow reason, doesn't always follow facts. It's based on an interesting calculation of the mind, calculation of the human condition. There are a lot of factors and a lot of variables. You can't argue with belief. Anyone tried before? It's not very fun. Even with our own, we get invitations, spiritual invitations to grow beyond our limited beliefs, but we can't always just pop ourselves right out of them. Makes sense they would see like that. They're coming from, you fill in the blank, XYZ. They're coming from their worldview. They're coming from their self-interest. They're coming from their paradigm. They're coming from their myopic vision. So that makes sense that they would speak like that. They would act like that. They would do that. And there are a lot of paradigms to come from. There's right and wrong. There's black and white thinking. There's us and them. There's everyone is against me. There's the world is not a safe place. And the list goes on and on. These paradigms are foundational and fundamental. And they are the birthplace of our experience and thus our reality. They are self-fulfilling prophecies, or a simpler way of understanding that is that they are simply co-creative. They create. When a paradigm is co-creative, it's like a program on a computer. It's used as a building block through which everything else operates. You simply can't get out of it or around what you're seeing until you're willing to see the program itself. The paradigm, which is really the program you are seeing with. And that's as hard to do as looking at yourself. Try it right now without a mirror. You're looking right at your screen so you can actually see yourself. You'd have to close your eyes. Well, you can't see yourself if you close your eyes. You got to turn around and try to look at yourself. You can't. We can see parts, but not the whole. Can you see your eyes? Some of you may be able to see your nose. I can see a little bit of mine. I can't even really see my chin. What can we see of ourselves? We can't. We can see parts, we cannot see the whole, not with the naked eye. It takes third eye seeing, it takes spiritual perspective, it takes a practice. Through meditation, mindfulness, or a contemplative practice, we begin to awaken to the transforming power of truth. And with the intention to behold the Christ or the light or the goodness or the core self, the high self, the holy self within others, we step into the adventure of the Great Awakening. And when that becomes our fundamental practice, our foundational truth, then and only then a vessel for something greater is created out of what we call our lives. So there are some simple tools to work with the mind, right? And I really, for me, and you try this on, because we don't trust something because someone else said it. We check it against our wisdom center. We check it against wise judgment. But for me in my practice, when I have tried to just stop judgment, it hasn't worked. But when I have entered the realm of not believing my judgments and recognize that my judgments come from my framework and they are what they are, but they're not truth, then they're just there. I don't have to believe them. I don't have to feel so awful about them. I don't have to do anything about them. It's just like, wow, that's interesting. That's still how your mind operates. Wow, that's interesting. I can feel that. It doesn't feel good. And I can be present to my practice rather than creating a hell out of what is offered in heaven. So here are some tools. I don't know if you could hear that. Could you hear that? That somehow is in effect with our talk. Because we just went from talking about what the mind does and moving into tools. And the screen said, recording stopped, recording in progress. That to me is like a blatant lesson on what exactly we were talking about. When we step into this space, the recording stops. It's like it drops all of the power out of the silliness of the ego and the mind and the separate self. It just drops it out. And then the recording starts again when we step into the divine judgment and we recognize like, oh, even though I'm thinking these things, even though that's my experience, even though it's tempting to demonize, I'm not going to power those thoughts. Hey, recording stop. That is exactly what happens in the spiritual practice when we step into this. When we step into this, when we don't step into it, it's recording is started. I am now recording all of this and I am birthing forth from it. But the second we say recording stop, and we step into the spiritual practice, it's like, no, I want to record, I want to birth from, I want to step into the truth principles. And that's that there is one power, one presence. We are all of it. You are of it. I am of it. This person that I am judging is of it. And so invite me, oh little mind, invite me into a deeper practice. Invite me into prayer, invite me into contemplation, invite me into meditation, invite me into holding the high watch for you, for our world. So here are our tools. Practice curiosity. Practice curiosity. Notice your thoughts. Name it. I like to name things interesting, but find a name that works for you, that doesn't feel judgy, but that works for you, that you could go, that's interesting. That's interesting. Number 4, practice loving kindness and mindfulness. Number 5, use the power to reframe. The power to reframe is stepping into different perspective. It's seeing it from a different way. It's actually getting involved with your thoughts. Reframing. Number 6, behold the Christ. Call it what you want to call it, the soul, the higher self, the unhindered idea of me, of humanity, of our divinity, but behold the Christ. And 7, open up to the power of compassion. Compassion for others and self-compassion. Remembering that transformed people transform people. Hurt people hurt people. And the light within me beholds the light within you. Namaste.